that, you know, if you put your mind to something, you can do things and you can make changes. That was in 1858. Of course, the Civil War starts right after that. If you read a lot of Civil War books, and I know there's one or two Civil War buffs in the room, I know who they are. But if you read a lot of Civil War books, they always start out with what caused the Civil War. And they always go the Kansas-Nebraska Act and you know, the Freeman's Act and the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision. They always set up the Civil War with all those. You read enough books, every once in a while, it will mention the Overland to Wellington rescue. Because it was one of the things that helped ignite the Civil War. And that's what, it was just another thing that made a rift between the North and the South, slave owners and the anti-slavery people. So the Civil War starts, of course, Plumb, big abolitionist. He's not looking at the Civil War as something to hold the Union together. He's looking at the Civil War as a way to end slavery. He's 45 years old now and too old to really join the fighting. James Garfield, though, organizes a regiment from northern Ohio. Garfield asks his now good friend, Ralph Plumb, if he would be his quartermaster and be on his staff in the Army of Ohio. Excuse me. So they go off to war together. Plumb sells his interest in the Hayes Plumb's 3 mercantile stores. He sells his interest, he gives the money to Marilla, and he says, this should hold you for a few months. War is not going to last much longer than that. So you'll be fine until I get home. And we know the war lasted for 4 years and she ran out of money long before that. But Plumb went off to the war, and Garfield was a great soldier. He was a great leader, a great general, a colonel, then he got moved up to a brigadier general, and then he became the general of the Army of Ohio, a full-fledged general. Each step of the way, he took Plumb with him to stay on his staff. Eventually, in 1863, 2 years into the war, people in northern Ohio are trying to convince Garfield that he needs to run for the United States Congress. I don't remember why there was an opening, somebody retired or died, but there was an opening. And it was Garfield's for the taking. He was the most popular man, he was a proven leader, he was a general in the war. All you gotta do is throw your hat in the ring and you've got it. And he was torn because he convinced 1,000 men from his home area to join the Civil War. And he felt like he would be abandoning them. Like, I get you guys to sign up for a 3-year enlistment, but I'm leaving to go to Washington. He didn't think that would go over well. So he was really torn because he wanted to be a congressman. He wanted to go to Washington, D.C. But he wanted to stay with his men. He felt responsible for his men. And so there were several weeks there where he was losing sleep and he was torn. One night, sitting in front of his tent around a campfire, it was just him and Ralph Plumb. And he was talking to Plumb, what do? I don't know what to do, I'm torn. He said, somebody else takes that seat, it might be 20 years before that seat comes open again, and then it'll be too late for me. And Plumb said, I've been waiting for you to ask me my opinion. I wasn't going to give it to you until you asked, but I knew you were torn over this. My opinion is there are a lot of good men in this army. There are a lot of good colonels, there are a lot of good brigadier generals who could step up into your, to run the Army of Ohio. But you're the only man I can think of that could really represent Northern Ohio in Congress. I can't think of anybody else better suited for that. There are a lot of guys who can run this army, but I think you're the man to be the congressman. And that's all Garfield needed to hear, was somebody to say, do it. And so he did. He ran. He got elected. When he went to Congress, I can't remember what committee he was on, but as soon as he was on some committee, that first opportunity he got, he brought Colonel Ralph Plumb, who is now a colonel himself, Colonel Ralph Plumb to Washington, D.C. to work in the War Department. He worked in logistics. He worked in quartermaster kind of duties. And in those duties, while he was in Washington, D.C. from 63 to 65, he met another man that was going to significantly, or was going to become a lifelong friend. And that man was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie did a lot of business in Washington, D.C. He was just starting out with the steel industry, and railroad lines were being built everywhere, and they all needed steel. And Carnegie was in Washington, D.C., rubbing elbows. And he was a personal friend of James Garfield also. So they had a common friend, and so Colonel Ralph Plumb and Andrew Carnegie became acquaintances. They knew each other. Carnegie was like 20, 25 years younger than Plumb. But they got to be friends and went to dinner a few times together. Eventually the war ended. After the war, Plumb was one of the very last people to get mustered out of service. The war ended in April of 1865. Most people by May or June were being sent home, mustered out of service. He didn't get mustered out of service until Christmas of 1865 because he was at the War Department. They had a lot of work to do, a lot of loose ends to tie up. He stayed there. He didn't get home until late January 1865 or 1866. When he got home, he didn't know what they were going to do. He no longer had his store for income. His wife, Marilla, had spent 3/4 of the 3 of the 4 years taking in boarders, doing laundry, sewing for people, whatever she could do to raise a few dollars just to keep food on the table. And so they were dead broke, and he had no idea what he was going to do. He was just a couple months shy of 50 years old, and he was dead broke. Now, 50 in mid-19th century was a very old person. I mean, you didn't have one foot in the grave yet, but you were past middle age. I don't know what the life expectancy was. I don't believe it was more than 60 or 65 back then. But anyway, there he is, dead broke, war's over, no job, no prospect. He could always open up another store, or maybe, renew his license and his attorney license and try to raise some money becoming an attorney. But you know what? He made a lot of contacts when he was at the War Department. And he knew a lot of movers and shakers. So he thought, maybe I'll go to New York City. Maybe I'll talk to this young Andrew Carnegie. He owns a lot of businesses. He might, have a job for me. So he goes to Cleveland, Ohio. He's at a train station in Cleveland, Ohio, waiting to take the train to New York to look for a job. When he happens to run into an old friend.